They called it Black Hollow, a quiet, unremarkable town nestled between dense forests and endless mist. It had a population of just under 300, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where secrets were whispered but never spoken aloud. Then, one night, Black Hollow simply vanished. No one remembers exactly when the story started circulating, but locals from nearby towns recall waking up one morning to an eerie silence where Black Hollow should have been. Roads that once led into the town now twisted into dead ends, as if the land had shifted overnight. Phone lines went silent, and attempts to reach anyone from the town were met with static. Authorities launched an investigation. Satellite images showed nothing. No houses, no buildings, not even the remains of roads. It was as if Black Hollow had never existed. But people remembered. They had visited, had friends there, and yet, there was no trace of it. Then, the rumors began. Some said the town had been swallowed by the earth, sinking into some hidden cavern below. Others whispered about a government experiment gone wrong, something unnatural that had to be erased. But the most chilling theory came from an old man in a neighboring town. "They took it," he muttered when asked. "The town," it was claimed. When asked what he meant, his gaze turned distant. "They say at night, you can still hear them calling. The ones who were left behind. But they're not human anymore. If you listen too closely, they'll pull you in too." No one took him seriously, until people started disappearing. Tourists drawn to the mystery began vanishing near where Black Hollow once stood. Hikers who ventured too close never returned. A journalist investigating the phenomenon sent one final message before going silent. "The town is still there. You just have to look the right way." The message was traced back to the exact spot where Black Hollow should have been. But the journalist was gone. And then, one night, a traveler passing through the area saw something strange. In the distance, where there should have been only forest, he swore he saw lights, faint, flickering, like the warm glow of houses. As if the town had never left. As if it was waiting for someone to find it. The rumors of Black Hollow's disappearance had drawn many investigators, but few ever returned. Those who did spoke in hushed tones, unwilling to share what they had seen. But there was one constant in all their accounts. On certain nights, when the mist was just right, a road appeared where none should exist. Ethan Carter was a journalist obsessed with uncovering urban legends, and Black Hollow was his latest obsession. He had studied every account, traced the last known locations of the missing, and found one eerie detail: every disappearance occurred at exactly 3:33 a.m. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan arrived at the site where Black Hollow should have been. There was nothing but forest, stretching endlessly in all directions. But he wasn't deterred. He set up camp and waited. The night stretched on, and the silence felt suffocating. Not a single sound, no insects, no wind, nothing. Then, at precisely 3:33 a.m., a change swept over the landscape. A road. It wasn't there before, but now it stretched ahead of him, lined with flickering streetlights. At the end of it, Ethan could see houses, buildings, a town. Black Hollow. He could hear distant sounds, laughter, the hum of life. The town looked frozen in time, like it had never disappeared. His pulse quickened. If he could step inside, document this, he'd have the story of a lifetime. He took a step forward. The air grew heavy, charged with something unseen. A whisper echoed from the trees. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan froze. The voice was barely audible, like wind through dead leaves, but it felt directed at him. He turned, but there was no one there. Then the laughter from the town changed. It distorted, warping into something unnatural. The flickering lights grew dim, revealing shapes, figures standing at the edge of the town, watching him. Their faces were shadowed, but their eyes glowed. Something moved behind him. Ethan turned just in time to see a hand reaching out of the darkness. The last thing he heard before everything went black was a single word, whispered directly into his ear. "Stay." Ethan's consciousness returned in waves, his mind sluggish as if wading through thick fog. His head pounded. The last thing he remembered was the voice, "Stay." He sat up, his body aching. Black hollow stretched before him. No longer distant, no longer flickering in and out of existence. He was standing in the middle of Main Street. The town was eerily normal. Buildings with old-fashioned signs, a diner with its neon lights buzzing softly, and houses with perfectly kept lawns. Yet, something was wrong. There were no people, no movement, no sound. Yet, the streetlights glowed. The diner's doors were wide open. A radio inside crackled static, then a fragment of a voice. "Come inside. We've been waiting." Ethan's breath hitched. He turned back toward where he had come from, but the road was gone. Only endless rows of houses surrounded him now, stretching into a horizon that shouldn't exist. A sudden noise. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from an alleyway beside the diner. Ethan pressed himself against a brick wall, heart hammering. A figure stepped into the dim glow of the streetlight. It was a man, or, at least, it looked like one. Dressed in an old suit, his skin was pale, his expression blank. His lips moved, though no sound came out. His eyes were the worst part, black voids, endless and hungry. Ethan didn't wait. He bolted, weaving through the empty streets. Buildings stretched too far, streets twisted the wrong way, leading him in circles. And then, he saw them. Dozens of figures standing at the end of the street. Men, women, children, all silent, all staring. And then, in unison, they whispered, "You can't leave. You are part of us now." The ground beneath Ethan shifted. The buildings trembled. A hand gripped his shoulder from behind. Cold, solid, unshakable. And then, everything turned to darkness. Ethan's mind swam in darkness. A sensation of falling gripped him, endless, weightless. Then, suddenly, he was awake. He gasped, sitting up, but he wasn't in the street anymore. He was inside a house. A small, dimly lit living room, old and untouched by time. The air smelled of dust and something rotting. The figures, the people of Black Hollow, were gone. But someone else was in the room. A girl. She stood by a dusty window, her back to him. Her dress was old-fashioned, her hair long and matted. Slowly, she turned her head, just enough for Ethan to see the edge of her face. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Ethan's pulse spiked. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a shaking hand and pointed to a wall of photographs. Ethan stood up slowly, his breath shallow. Dozens of black and white portraits stared back at him. Men, women, children, their faces frozen in time, some smiling, others solemn. His eyes moved lower. The last row of photos looked new. His stomach lurched. One of the photos was of him. Fresh. Recent. As if it had been taken just minutes ago. "They always take one," the girl said. Ethan spun around. She was closer now. He could finally see her face. Her eyes were hollow sockets. Deep, black voids. His breath caught in his throat as she whispered, "They took mine, too." The walls shuddered. The light flickered. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked open. And something stepped inside. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, tap, tap, tap. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Getting closer. Ethan froze, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The girl stood still, her hollow eyes fixed on the open doorway. "You have to leave," she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. "How? There's no way out." His voice was barely above a breath. The footsteps stopped. Then, a whisper. Indistinct, but wrong, like a voice played backward on a tape. It slithered through the air, curling around the walls. The girl tensed. "Don't listen to it," she said. "No matter what it says." Ethan backed away, his own photograph staring at him from the wall. His vision blurred, panic sinking its claws into his mind. Then, a shadow slid into the room. Not walking. Gliding. A tall, distorted figure, its body wrapped in something shifting, like smoke struggling to take form. The whispering grew louder. The girl grabbed Ethan's wrist. Her fingers were ice cold. "Run!" She yanked him toward the hallway as the shadow lunged. The walls warped, stretching and bending as they ran. Doors appeared and disappeared, the hallway twisting like a maze. The town was shifting around them. "We're not supposed to leave," the girl panted. Ethan didn't stop. He didn't look back. He could hear it chasing them, the whisper turning into a sickening screech. Then, a door burst open ahead. A glimpse of the outside. The street. The fog. Freedom. They raced toward it. But just as Ethan reached the threshold, something grabbed his ankle. A cold, clawed hand. He fell forward, his fingers just inches from escaping. The girl turned, her hollow eyes filled with something that almost looked like sorrow. "They won't let you go," the whispering voice laughed. And the door slammed shut. Ethan's scream was swallowed by the darkness. He kicked and thrashed, but the icy hand around his ankle wouldn't let go. A deep, rattling breath echoed from behind him, a sound that wasn't human. "Please, help!" Ethan gasped, reaching toward the girl. She stood frozen at the door, her hollow eyes flickering with something ancient. Something knowing. "You were never meant to leave," she whispered. The whispering voice swirled around them, speaking in words that twisted and dissolved before they could be understood. The shadowy figure loomed closer, its presence thick like tar, pressing into his mind. Ethan felt something change. A slow, sinking sensation. The air became heavy. His limbs, sluggish. He looked at the walls, at the floor beneath him. Everything was flickering. The room wasn't just dark anymore, it was decaying. The wallpaper peeled back, revealing something that looked like bones. Ethan's breath hitched. "This place eats people," the girl whispered. Her words hit like ice. The whispers grew clearer. "Ethan, you were here before." No, that wasn't possible. His pulse pounded in his ears. "That's a lie," he said, forcing himself to move. He kicked hard, breaking free from the clawed grip. The moment his foot hit the ground, the floor shifted. It was like stepping on water. The wood rippled, and suddenly, he wasn't in the room anymore. The world twisted, and Ethan found himself standing outside. But something was wrong. The town was empty. Too empty. The buildings were rotting, covered in ivy, their windows shattered. The street was cracked, like it had been abandoned for decades. And then he saw it. His own photograph, tacked to a rusted pole. It was old, faded, weathered. And below his picture, one chilling word. Missing. Ethan's chest tightened. Somewhere behind him, the whisper returned. "Welcome back." Ethan staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. The missing poster with his own face on it stared back at him, aged and weathered, as if it had been there for years. "No, this isn't real," he whispered. But everything around him disagreed. The buildings, dilapidated. The street, cracked and lifeless. The air, thick with silence. The town was gone. Or rather, it had been gone for a long time. Ethan turned in frantic circles, searching for something, anything, that made sense. But every sign, every street corner, every landmark he had once known was now just a crumbling ruin. And then, he heard it. A faint, distorted melody. It floated through the air, distant yet familiar, a tune he couldn't quite place. It whispered through the empty streets, curling around him like a ghostly lullaby. This isn't right. He took a shaky step forward. His foot landed on something brittle. Looking down, his stomach dropped. Another photograph. It was of a woman and a child. Their faces were blurred, but the child's outline looked like him. Beneath the photo, in faded ink, were scrawled words. "If you remember, it's already too late." Ethan's blood ran cold. The whispers returned. Not from one voice. From many. They rose and fell, a chorus of overlapping murmurs that slithered into his ears. He came back. He was never supposed to remember. It's watching. Ethan's heart pounded. He turned, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Then, movement. Down the street, at the edge of the ruined town, something shifted. A tall figure stood beneath a flickering street lamp. Its head was tilted, watching him. Then, it moved. Fast. Ethan turned and ran. The whispers chased him, curling around his ears, pressing into his mind. You left, but you never truly escaped. The road beneath him cracked and crumbled, swallowing his steps. The town was closing in. And somewhere, behind him, the figure was getting closer. Ethan ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, his footsteps echoing through the hollow remains of the town. The ruined streets twisted into a maze, each turn leading him deeper into somewhere he shouldn't be. But behind him, it followed. The tall figure with its featureless face never ran, it only glided closer, step by step, as if time itself was bending to its will. The whispers rose. The town remembers. The town watches. The town never lets go. Ethan stumbled, his hands scraping against the cracked pavement. Pain flared through his palms, but there was no time to stop. He pushed himself forward, his eyes darting for an escape. Then, through the shifting mist, he saw it, the old church. It was the only structure still standing untouched, its steeple rising like a jagged knife against the sky. A faint light flickered inside. A chance. Ethan sprinted toward it, the whispers now a roaring chorus behind him. As he reached the heavy wooden doors, they swung open on their own. He didn't question it. He lunged inside, slamming them shut just as the whispers cut off, as if the air had been sucked from the world outside. Silence. Ethan pressed his back against the door, his chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. The candlelit interior of the church was wrongly preserved, untouched by decay. And then, he saw them. Rows of figures filled the pews. Silent. Still. Watching. Their faces were covered in cloth masks, stitched with ancient symbols, their bodies wrapped in tattered funeral robes. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. One of them, the one in the front row, turned its head. And then, in a dry, cracked voice, it spoke. You shouldn't have come back. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The robed figures in the pews remained still, their stitched cloth masks giving them an eerie, lifeless appearance. But the one in the front row, the one that had spoken, tilted its head further, its unseen gaze drilling into him. You shouldn't have come back. Ethan took a step back. The wooden floor creaked beneath him, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the church. I never meant to, he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. The figure slowly rose. The others followed. One by one, they stood, unmoving, staring, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded. He had to get out. But then, the candles flickered, and the whispers returned. The town remembers. The town watches. The town never lets go. The walls of the church shifted, the wooden beams cracking and stretching like something alive. The stained glass windows darkened, their images warping, twisting into watching eyes. Ethan turned for the door, but it was gone. In its place was a stone wall, ancient and unbreakable. No, 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 his hand scraped against the surface, but there was nothing, no handle, no seam, no way out. The robed figures stepped closer, their movements unnatural, as if their bodies were controlled by something unseen. And then, the lead figure spoke again. You belong to the town now. Ethan turned, just in time to see black tendrils of shadow slithering toward him, reaching for his legs, his arms, his throat. He screamed as the darkness wrapped around him, pulling him down, dragging him into the floor itself. Into the town. Into the forgotten place that never let go. And then, silence. The figures returned to their seats. The church was still once more. And in the first row, where no one had sat before, a new figure now rested. Head bowed. Robed. Masked. Another soul, lost to the town. Darkness. Ethan's consciousness flickered, his body weightless, suspended in a void beneath the town. The whispers, closer now, louder, filled his ears, the voices blending into something inhuman. "You are one of us. You will never leave. The town remembers." His body jerked as if unseen hands were pulling him deeper. The ground, if it even was ground, felt soft, shifting, alive. Then, a sudden jolt. Ethan gasped, his eyes snapping open. He was outside the church. But something was wrong. The air was still, the streets empty, the buildings hollowed out, their windows gaping like black eyes. The town, once eerie but intact, was now a husk, a ruin, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. He stumbled forward, his footsteps echoing unnaturally. His car was still at the edge of the road, right where he'd left it. Something wasn't right. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. The screen was cracked, but the date, February 10, 1983, made his stomach lurch. That wasn't possible. The town hadn't just trapped him. It had rewritten him. A sharp, cold breeze passed through him, carrying a faint whisper, his own voice. "You were never here." Ethan turned toward the church's reflection in the shattered windows of a nearby shop. But in the glass, he wasn't there. The realization clawed at his throat. He wasn't a visitor anymore. He was part of the town. And no one outside would ever remember he existed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the town faded once more, swallowed by the night, waiting, watching, ready for its next traveler.